Salam from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, striking workers have been attacked at South Africa dairy major Clover. Israel plans to reintroduce a racist citizenship law and protests in America demanding justice for Amir Locke. On Monday, the 7th of Feb, taxi driving thugs attacked picketing workers at the Clayville plant of South Africa's largest dairy employer, Clover, where 5,000 workers have been on strike since November the 22nd. 3 of the injured workers had to be hospitalized. 2 of them had allegedly been locked up inside the plant, where they were stripped naked and beaten for hours. 4 people have been arrested for carrying out the attack. The General Industries Workers Union of South Africa and the Food and Allied Workers Union, which are jointly leading the strike, have blamed management. The attack comes around a week after the last meeting of the workers with management. They appeared to be on the retreat, making several concessions, including the offer to reinstate 763 workers it retrenched in November 2021 with full pay for a further 8 months. Prashant, what is going on the ground?
Right, Siddhant. So we'll come to, of course, the larger context of the strike maybe a bit later. But immediately, as far as this event is concerned, a very unfortunate and disastrous, deadly event, so to speak, because the 2 workers were basically kidnapped by, like you said, taxi driving thugs. Some of these taxi drivers, people who were driving these taxis, had supposedly been transporting scab workers or workers who were breaking the picketing line for quite some time. So, at some point, they just arrived there and there was a bit of panic. They seized 3 workers. The other striking workers were able to rescue one of their comrades who had to be taken to hospital. The other 2 were dragged inside the factory premises and the gates were shut. And apparently the police did go in after a while with an ambulance but came out much later. And the important thing to note, like you said, 2 of them beaten for quite a long time, hospitalized. Significantly, the people who did take them in did not come out. So it's a big question that the workers are asking in terms. So we were still waiting for some more updates from both the management and the police if they have anything to say on this. But the fact is that initially, at least at the time of the incident, these people were not caught. And there were only 2 gates and workers were outside these 2 gates. So the big question was, where were they? So like you said, later 4 people have been arrested. Still details a bit hazy, but nonetheless, a very unfortunate escalation. This is not the first attack. In last month, we talked about this. In the first week of January, there had been attacks. There had been, I think one of the striking workers' cars were attacked. They had received threatening calls, and this strike has been going on since November 2021. So we're almost about December, January, February, the 3rd month. On the 22nd of February will be the 3rd month. So this is a very problematic escalation, part of a larger trend, and I think this. While it's still unclear what exactly the nature of responsibility of the various players are, it remains to, one does hope that it will be properly investigated, that there will be a proper accounting of these kind of attacks, because if the attempt, this is part of a larger trend and we need to also see it that way. So we're still waiting for some more details regarding the exact nature of the attacks itself, but the workers are very much on the watch.
And since also they were taken inside factory premises, some questions definitely for management to answer.
Absolutely.
But give us a broader context of where the negotiations on this strike have proceeded to, Prashant.
Right. So 2 things. One, like you mentioned, the recent negotiations had seen a bit of a retreat from the management. The workers are not happy entirely because, the concessions that the management has made are still much short of what the workers are demanding. Now, it's important to understand this in the context of the larger debate, which is that 5,000 workers are on strike led by Jiwusa and Fawu. Now, the context is when the Clover, which is a dairy giant in South Africa, was taken over by Milko, which is partly owned by CBC, which is an Israeli bottling company. The understanding at that time, this is 2019, was that until October 2022 there would be no retrenchments, and that in fact 500 jobs would be added. So this was these were the explicit terms on which that kind of merger or takeover was actually accepted by the government authorities, right? But what happened was that we saw that about 700 jobs or 800 jobs were already lost, not directly through firings, but through voluntary retirements that people had to take because the plants were being shifted around. And then there were proposals to again fire more people, which were coming in much before this October 2022 deadline. Right? And then there are a lot of other complaints that the workers have raised. We've interviewed, the leaders of the trade union on this who talked about some of these issues. So overall, there was a very strong sense had developed among the workers that this was an attempt to basically gut Clover. And their claim, of course, was that this was part of a larger strategy to sort of bring products from outside, from the Israeli companies' products into the market, so that Clover would not be in any position to compete. So the factory shutdowns, the retrenchments, all be leading to that. So in fact, the workers have said that, if there is an economic problem involved, why can't the salary of the CEO be cut? And he earns a huge amount of money. Or why can't the loans given to shareholders, for instance, be be used to finance this instead of? So why is it that the workers have to bear the losses while the shareholders shareholders and the management continue to reap the kind of profits we're talking about? So that's really been their claim. So they've said that this whole argument of financial, which is often used when it comes to a lot of these companies, this kind of financial crunch, that is the excuse used to fire workers across the world, is actually a fraudulent excuse, considering some of these kind of expenses and the kind of massive benefits that the top of the management get. So the workers' real question is, why can't the money be redeployed there instead of this? The other important aspect is the Palestinian aspect, because CBC's factories are basically occupied territories. So there's been a very strong movement from the beginning on this. When this issue came up in 2019 during the merger, the South African government agency did say that it was outside its jurisdiction. But it's very important to note that this strike that is going on has been strongly supported by Palestinian solidarity advocates. We have a wide variety of trade union confederations. There was SAFTU, South African Federation of Trade Unions, has been there from the very beginning. We have COSATU, the South African Communist Party, all of whom have also sort of come into the picture right now. So there's been a broad solidarity of trade unions, of political organizations, of Palestinian solidarity movements which have come together on this issue, which is why it's really not just a strike in one company in South Africa, but in some senses a global protest or a global strike in that sense, because these are issues which are just beyond one company and one sector, and actually talk about a larger issue around this. So we can probably see, I think the discussions are definitely going to continue. The workers, I think, holding firm to some demands. There'll always be compromise. But I think the workers are very clear that they do not. One is, of course, they put forward the demand that Clover be nationalized, and it be divested of the Israeli company's ownership. And even the other negotiations, I think, will be very clear on sticking to these demands, which ensure that Clover can continue as a sustainable organization and it not be gutted.
All right. Thanks for that update. And you led us very well into what is our next story, of course, on the note that from the unions who are leading this, that this strike will continue. Our next story is from Israel itself, where the parliament approved the introduction of the Citizenship and Entry into Israel bill on Monday, despite opposition from some members of the coalition government. If passed, the proposed law would prevent Palestinians living in the occupied territories and elsewhere from living with their spouses in Israel. The bill seeks to reintroduce a racist law which was first enacted in 2003. It had expired after losing majority support in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, in July last year, when the new coalition government under Naftali Bennett came into power. The coalition includes the left-wing Meretz and the Arab Islamist Party, who all oppose the continuation of the law. I spoke earlier to People's Dispatch's Abdul, who's been covering the story. Right, Abdul, so tell us a bit more about this racist, controversial citizenship law.
Basically, this is an old law. It was first passed in 2003, during the time when the Second Intifada was going on, and Israelis thought that there is a imminent danger from Palestinians. So on the basis of that, what they did, they basically prevented all the spouses of Palestinian citizens. There is a substantial number of Palestinians within Israel. Around 20-21% population is basically Palestinian Arab. So they have family links with Palestinians living in the occupied territories and Palestinians living in other countries as refugees, like in Lebanon, Syria, and so on and so forth. So they intermarry. That marriage is quite often. So what the law did, that they prohibited all those people who have married, Israeli citizens who have married to a Palestinian in the occupied territory, or the Palestinians outside the historic Palestine. It simply means that they cannot live together. If they want to, they choose to live in Israel. So that basically, and this law was basically an yearly law, a temporary law. It was originally for 1 year. It had to expire in 2004, but the subsequent governments kept on extending the terms of the law. It was questioned in the Supreme Court twice, and twice the Supreme Court, in a majority judgment, supported the law on various grounds. We can discuss that later. But this law finally expired last year after a new government took over, in which, for the first time, there was a Arab-Palestinian group part of the government. The RAM, the Arab Joint List, became the part of the government, and because of that, and it was a very thin majority, and because of that, what happened, that they did not get enough votes to extend the law, so it expired. The government wants to reintroduce the law, and that is what is happening at this moment.
Right. So given that the same coalition government is still in power, Naftali Bennett's government is still in power, what has changed in the sort of power dynamic that they are wanting to reintroduce this law or extend its term, whatever the case might be?
See, Naftali Bennett government is basically is a kind of government which has all kinds of ideological stream, from ultra right wing to the left wing to the Arab Islamicist parties, RAM. So and they have a majority of 2 seats in the Knesset. So what is happening, that the ultra right wing Interior Minister Alet Shaked wants to reintroduce the law with the help of the ultra right wing groups in opposition. So she has come out with a very strange compromise formula, in which the government will support introduction of a more conservative and more racist law instead of the existing law, instead of the law they want to introduce. And because of that compromise, they will also vote in favor of the extension of or reintroduction of this particular law. This has led to a crazy political situation in Israel, in which the parties which are part of the ruling coalition are opposing the bill. 2 of them, particularly the left-wing Merits and the Islamicist RAM, along with the parties of the Arab Joint List, they are opposing, which are in opposition, which are opposing the extension of the law. But the parties in opposition are supporting the government. So what happened yesterday, on Monday, basically, that when the Arab Joint List forced the introduction of the bill, converted into a confidence motion, most of the pro-government parties, the parties in the coalition, left the parliament, and which led to only opposition voting in favor. So that kind of crazy situation has been created primarily on the basis of the ultra right-wing ideology. So ultra right-wing ideologies across the spectrum have come together, whether they are in the government or whether they are opposed to government. So this is a situation which has been created. We do not know whether this will affect the stability of the government or not. But there are chances that this may lead to a new kind of realignment in the government coalition in Israel.
Also bringing into sort of another aspect to bring back into focus what we've been talking about over the past week with the Amnesty report and all of that, talking about how Israel's policies towards Palestinians are generally shaped and how it unites people despite where they might sit in terms of the House of Parliament. All right, thanks very much, Abdul, for that. And finally, this past weekend, thousands in the city of Minneapolis mobilized to demand justice for Amir Locke, a 22-year-old black man who was fatally shot by the police in the early hours of February 2nd. Nearly 1,000 Minnesotans took to the streets on Saturday despite freezing conditions, marching from the Hennepin County Government Building to the first police precinct of the city of Minneapolis. We spoke to Natalia Marquez, who's been covering the story for People's Dispatch.
Thank you, Natalia, so much for joining us. So yet another incident of a killing of a black man in Minneapolis, and we see that a lot of protests happening. So maybe could you first take us to what exactly happened when Amir Locke was killed by the police?
Sure. So last Wednesday night, or early hours in the morning, actually, Amir Locke was sleeping at a family member's house where he was staying Police came in, executed a no-knock warrant, which means that they entered the home without any warning or any knocking, legally. And they, barged down the door. They saw that there was someone sleeping on the couch. They kicked the couch. Amir woke up and reached for his what his family says is a legally registered weapon, pointing it away from officers with his finger off of the trigger. As soon as I saw that weapon, officers did not tell him to drop the weapon. Officer Mark Hanneman shot him 3 times fatally, immediately within 9 seconds of entering the house. And then Amir Locke later died in the hospital. So it was another example of a completely irrational killing of a completely innocent person.
Right. So Natalia, in this context, could you elaborate a bit more on the no-knock warrants themselves? They are a very controversial move. In fact, in Minnesota itself, I believe there has been a lot of debate about it. So could you just take us to that as well?
Yeah, so no-knock warrants really have come under increased scrutiny, especially after the killing of Breonna Taylor. Police entered her home in the middle of the night and killed her while she was in her sleep while executing a no-knock warrant. And so this practice is actually very common in American police and the US police. But it's way more fatal for civilians than police, way more dangerous for civilians than police. Civilians do tend to die, get injured. There was a horrible case of a baby getting horribly burned during the execution of a no-knock warrant. They were originally meant to be, kind of rare last resort tactics. They became legal during the war on drugs, the infamous war on drugs in the 1970s. But they quickly escalated to become an extremely common tactic. In fact, a Vox report found that 20,000 no-knock warrants are executed in the United States every single year. And so they're common, they're used by police, and they can be deadly. And in Minneapolis especially, shortly after the uprisings, the 2020 protests against police brutality, after the death of George Floyd, Jacob Frey put in his re-election website that he had banned the use of no-knock warrants, which was not true. He had simply scaled back the use of them. And so this recent death of Amir Locke has drawn a lot of scrutiny towards that and towards the mayor as well for this false claim. And so, yeah, they continue to be extremely controversial, and there's a push to make them illegal.
Right. And in this context, could you also tell us a bit about the kind of protests that are taking place, not only in Minneapolis, but across the country as well?
Yeah. So in Minneapolis, last weekend, there were 3 protests. There was a car caravan on Friday. 1,000 people took to the streets on Saturday, and another car caravan on Sunday that went directly to the what is believed to be the residence of interim police chief Amelia Huffman, and demanded her resignation. And then on Saturday, thousands took to the streets. Amir Locke's father was there. He asked, of the Minneapolis Police Department what gave them the right to be the judge, jury, and executioner, because they did in fact execute, an execution of Amir Locke, an extrajudicial one. And so, yeah, and throughout the country, there's also been, a wave of protest and just outrage and increased scrutiny towards not only the practice of no-knock warrants, but also just the issue of police brutality and police murder itself in the United States. Every time one of these cases happen, since it's such a pressing issue in the entire country, starts paying attention again.
Right. And quickly, maybe finally, if you could actually take us through some of the demands that are maybe coming out in Minneapolis itself on this issue.
Yeah, so there's a wide range of demands. Obviously, the banning of no-knock warrants, the real banning of no-knock warrants. But then there's also the broader demand to, prosecute and investigate the officers who murder people and put them in jail. Because, this is not something that, many people in the U.S. think that U.S. cops have can execute people with impunity without any punishment, which sometimes turns out to be true. And so there's a push to hold officers accountable so that, in the future, there can be some hesitation, there's some hesitation in the minds of police before they start, shooting and killing people. So it's, also jailing the police officers and just ending police brutality and ending police terror. There's various forms of police terror in the United States. It's not just murder. It's also things like stop and frisk, things like, violently repressing protests, pepper spray. So, all of those demands are very linked, just ending police violence, especially in Black communities in the United States.
Thank you so much, Natalia.
And that's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. From me and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you very much for watching. For more on all of these stories, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.